Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to those of you who are here with us in the auditorium and also those who are watching online and via a live Facebook feed. We are talking this morning about China and global 5G, although our topic is really a little bit broader than that. And the subtitle is trying to get the questions right, trying to frame the issues that you have been reading about probably every morning, which seem to be unfolding at a dizzying rate, trying to get the questions right about what is technology-based, what is national security-based, what is economic. Over the past 5 years, really, there have been three major changes in U.S.-China relations, all related. The first is that a relationship that has always been both competitive and cooperative is now characterized more by contention, by adversity, than by engagement. There has been a fundamental shift to a more competitive or more contentious relationship. The second major change, I would argue, is that this is now a worldwide competition. This is not just Beijing to Washington. The competition is playing out globally as these two nations compete to play leading roles in shaping security architectures, trading and financial regimes, norms and practices, and value systems. And then, third large change is that these nations are also competing to play a leading role in the development, sale, installation, and regulation of new technologies. Much as Beijing and Washington disagree, one of the issues that both sides now seem to agree on is that innovation, mastery and leadership of 5G systems, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, emerging biotechnologies. The mastery of technology henceforth is going to be the key to hard power, military power, economic power, soft power, and global leadership. Beijing and Washington seem to agree on this. Already this focus on innovation has caused major difficulties for academia, and we spent a lot of time on this at the Kissinger Institute, trying to help American universities, colleges, and the national institutions that manage them understand how they can remain free and open universities while responding to very real threats from Beijing and security concerns from Washington. So it's of interest to academics, but it's much bigger than that. I think what we see, again, if you're watching the daily flow of news, is that our technophilia and our technophobia are merging with our sinophilia and sinophobia and have become a way of asking about our own national well-being and our place in the world. This tech challenge from China is causing us to rethink some of our economic models, our defense models, and our modes of governance. And this is true not only in the United States, but in many leading industrialized nations. In a piece yesterday in the Financial Times called "China Gains the Upper Hand Over Germany," the author, Wolfgang Munchau, I apologize for slaughtering the pronunciation of his last name, put it like this. He said, "This is a fundamental European problem. Unlike in China, macroeconomic policy, industrial policy, and foreign and security policy in Europe are run independently of each other. The Huawei 5G bid shows that the EU is not well prepared to deal with a connection between security and industrial policy. Nor have the Europeans paid much attention to the impact of their fiscal rules, not least on defense and security policies. China, by contrast, has an integrated approach to economic and foreign policy." And so this is a new issue. It touches on many aspects of our national well-being, and therefore it's not surprising that we have been overreacting in some cases and have had difficulty framing these issues poorly. As we said in our advertisement for this event today, there are at least three different levels that we see in our concern about 5G and Chinese technology generally. This tends to focus around questions of Huawei right now, but it's broader than Huawei. One is the specific concern about espionage, about backdoors and other means of spying through installed Chinese technologies, and also the vulnerability that the use of Chinese components may cause for various aspects of our national infrastructure. So there's a discrete espionage and security issue. Then there's the level of commercial competition. And you will often read in the same article, the same paragraph, that this is about keeping our own national champions, our own companies at the lead of these new technologies. Our desire to dominate these technologies and retain our preeminence also plays into the reception of Chinese components, Chinese technologies. And there's a claim, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, that even if China's methods of competition were licit, if they played by fair rules, and there are many cases in which they seem not to, even if they were, that China's ambitions to technological greatness are somehow illegitimate or a de facto threat, even if the rules of the road were observed. And then there's also the level at which the technological competition becomes the key to a competition for global preeminence. So obviously there's a lot of overlap between these three kinds of concerns, but the categories are often confused in our public discourse. And it often reads as though the installation of Chinese-made 5G routers and servers may be a key factor, not just in competition between global tech firms, but it often reads like a key factor in the historic struggle between good and evil. Some of this boils down to who do you like, who do you trust, America or China going forward. So today we're going to try to work out where we are, and we are delighted to have three leading experts on different aspects of these questions. We will hear first from Naomi Wilson, who is the Senior Director of Policy for Asia at the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, where she focuses on law enforcement and homeland security, cybersecurity, especially with relation to China and Asia. Before joining ITI, she was at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she was most recently the acting director for Asia Pacific, where she played a leading role on cybersecurity, law enforcement, and customs cooperation issues as a senior advisor to then Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. She also led the development and implementation of policy initiatives at the Department of Homeland Security for its engagement with China in the area of cybercrime and related issues, and also worked on the U.S.-China high-level dialogue on cybercrime. Prior to that, she was on the staff of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and like all of our speakers today, is a Mandarin speaker, a Mandarin expert. Yes, so that's sort of a key criteria for taking the stage today. She'll be followed by Jimmy Goodrich to my left, who is the Vice President for Global Policy of the Semiconductor Industry Association. In that capacity, he works closely with all of the member companies, the administration here at the White House, Congress, domestic and international stakeholders, and also foreign government officials to try to advance the Semiconductor Industry Association's international policy agenda. He is also an executive committee member of the United States Information Technology Office, where he represents the SIA. Jimmy has over a decade of experience working with Chinese and global stakeholders on tech issues, and also served recently as the Director of Global Policy at ITI, where he worked on China, Asia-Pacific tech policy issues related to cybersecurity, trade, and internet governance. Prior to that, he also worked on government affairs, Greater China government affairs for Cisco Systems. Jimmy will then be followed by Dennis Wilder, who is, I think, probably known to most of you. He is Assistant Professor of the Practice in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and also serves as Managing Director of Georgetown's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Before coming to Georgetown, he served as the National Security Council's Director for China from 2004 to 2005, and then as the NSC Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asian Affairs from 2005 to 2009, which took him to Asia many times, including for the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Absolutely. You had a seat in the stands.
I did.
Very good.
I got to see Mr. Phelps do his thing in the great bubble there, and it was tremendous. And, of course, the American Dream Team of basketball.
Which was the opening game.
Which was the opening game, and I must say the Chinese audience cheered just as loudly for the American team as they did for the Chinese team that night.
From 2009 to 2015, Dennis served as senior editor of the President's Daily Brief. This is the worldwide intelligence update, which is produced under the Director of National Intelligence, which begins the day in the White House. From 2015,
it used to.
Well, we've talked about that. We're not going to go into that today. From 2015 to 2016, he was the CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. So a great lineup today. Again, thanks to all of you for coming. And I would like in particular to thank my colleague, Ray Jung at the Kissinger Institute, who leads for us on following all things tech and who's a key driver in putting this together today. So thanks to you, Ray. So again, let's start with Naomi, and then we'll go to Jimmy and Dennis. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me this morning. It's great to see all of you and your interest in China and U.S. tech issues. So I'll start off by saying, Robert, thank you for holding this event. In particular, your framing of the need to get the questions right is especially important because we're in an environment with a lot of assumptions, a lot of assertions, and a lot of conflation, where facts are not necessarily relied upon in the way that I think we would like to see them. So essentially, you can't understand the problem until you understand what question you're trying to solve for. So discussions like this are extremely helpful. There's a definite need to have informed discussions to talk about threats and risks and what they mean in the context of the US and China and tech, and how and whether threats can be mitigated. Just to say it's China, therefore it's a threat, is not sufficient in a global economy, and it's not instructive as we look to see how the U.S. can advance in technological innovations and compete with China going forward. So at ITI, which is my association, we pride ourselves on working with the public sector to develop fact-based and rigorous analyses of problems and assessments and try to find out what is the right policy solution going forward. So in my opening remarks today, I'd like to outline a few things. First is how the U.S. government and industry view challenges with respect to China and tech. And I'll be pulling a little bit from my background at DHS as well as my current position at ITI working with tech companies. I'll also speak a bit to how the U.S. government perspective has evolved over the past few years and into the current administration, and the need for public and private sector partnership in order to identify these questions and work together to resolve them. So with that, with respect to the U.S. government and industry concerns, I would say that they are similar, yet there are differences in tactics and approach, and obviously for the U.S. government in particular, there is a heavy emphasis on what constitutes a national security threat. I will say that I feel very fortunate in the private sector that the tech industry has such a good relationship with the U.S. government, especially with issues that are of greatest concern regarding China's tech policies. The U.S. government has been great at listening to industry input and concerns in terms of understanding the dynamics of that market. So industry concerns should come as no real surprise. These are longstanding concerns involving market access, foreign companies' inability to obtain licenses and compete on equal footing with Chinese companies, data localization requirements, forced partnerships with Chinese companies, and security review regimes that are ambiguous, to say the least.
Data localization requirements, could you break that
sure.
one
Can I
down a little
define? I did not use an acronym, though. Do I get points for that? So data localization is an issue that we see not only in China, but around the world. Tech companies, and not only tech companies, any modern-day multinational company relies on the flow of data across borders for purposes of serving their customers. And it's not only customer data, but it's also cybersecurity data. For example, sharing vulnerabilities to determine whether certain systems are affected and how to patch those vulnerabilities. So that instantaneous real-time flow of information is essential to doing business and to maintaining network security. China and other countries have taken to instituting or at least drafting policies that require data to be maintained in country. So companies are required to build servers that house the data in country. The idea being that if it's closer, then law enforcement, government has greater access to it or easier access, or they can control it to a better degree. Those are all false assumptions, but that's another conversation. So I'll stop there on data localization. So in terms of the U.S. government concerns, currently we see an array of concerns, and I think this is emblematic of policymakers and U.S. citizens trying to come to terms with the competitive and cooperative dynamics between the U.S. and China, and to what extent economic security also affects national security. So we've seen a lot of blurred lines between these two elements that used to be dealt with pretty distinctly. And I want to make clear also that when we talk about security, and especially national security, I know that often there's a number of characterizations in the media of big tech companies and putting the profit first. I want to make clear that tech companies take national security and security of systems in general extremely seriously. It is part of their livelihood. It is what they stake their name on and their consumers' trust in them on. So it's really not an either-or situation from a tech company perspective, and I want to make that clear. In terms of what we hear most often from the U.S. government regarding their concerns, it's a mix of economic and security. A lot of them mirror our own concerns along the lines of market access and unfair Chinese tech and trade policies. And these are being dealt with currently in the context of the 301 investigation, which is led by USTR, and the ongoing trade talks. We also see concerns with respect to the economic impact of IP theft, as well as what it means to have an unfair technological advantage and what risk that poses in the future. Chinese investment in the U.S. is another security concern that the U.S. government has worked on over the past year. We've seen the reform of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or CFIUS, which was reformed via legislation last year, as well as attention to export control laws, which control the export of potentially sensitive technology for national security purposes. And Commerce is working on implementing an updated process of that right now. Then we see the various supply chain concerns, and this varies from respect to specific companies or the desire to move supply chains back to the U.S. And we see, it seems like on a weekly basis, new bills coming out of the Hill that have this focus on what does the supply chain mean to security and to American economic status generally. And finally, there's the big question of technological competitiveness, and is China winning in the race for AI and 5G? So as the U.S. government is trying to deal with all of these things, and as the private sector is trying to keep up with their efforts to deal with all of these various policies and inform that process, I think it's also important to take a step back and to look at the evolution of the current USG concerns. So over the past decade, the U.S. government has become somewhat used to China gaming the system and playing by its own rules. There had been a general thought that bringing China into the fold, into the international system, would help normalize Chinese practices over time. And this has worked in some respects and not others. I think we've seen pretty dramatic changes outside of the realm of tech in China's approach to climate change. But with respect to their alignment with the WTO, not so much. So there was a general acceptance, as you mentioned, Robert, in your opening remarks, of the competitive and cooperative relationship between the U.S. and China. And I think that is still true, and that needs to be constantly reinforced because China's not going anywhere and we're not going anywhere. And our relationships are so intertwined that it behooves us to make sure that that relationship functions. So in the current administration, I've seen the U.S. become increasingly fed up with China's behavior and beginning to respond in a more assertive way. And this goes back to the previous administration. There was definitely a shift towards the end of the Obama administration of being more assertive, tolerating more friction in the relationship, and accepting that China might be embarrassed by certain things and react. So we might no longer have a cyber dialogue between the two countries. And so China responded to a number of U.S. actions, including indictments of Chinese PLA hackers, increasingly public criticism of China's theft of IP via cyber hacking, including right up to the run-up of President Xi's 2015 state visit with President Obama, and sanctioning Chinese companies for violations of U.S. export controls. So in the current administration and in Congress, there's increasingly heightened concerns, and tech seems to be more and more at the center. There's even less tolerance for Chinese behavior and empty commitments, and I think there's a lot of validity to that sentiment. So right now we see the administration, and in particular USTR Ambassador Lighthizer, coming down harder on China's unfair trade practices. We see new supply chain policies and legislation, many of which have named specific companies and intend to ban those companies, export control reform, and this has all led to increasing and I think troubling drive to wall off U.S. tech in order to safeguard it and to protect our crown jewels that may be used for national security purposes and or for competitive advantage. And there's been a lot of talk of bringing the supply chains back to the U.S. Can't you just get out of China? Why don't you make things in the U.S.? It would be so much better for the U.S. economy. Never mind that we're in a global economy with intertwined supply chains. And restricting exports of our valued technology. So policymakers are asking a lot of big, complex questions that will have significant ripple effects for the tech sector, for the economy, and for U.S. technological competitiveness. And I think now is a really important time to step back and unpack those questions and unpack the assumptions that are leading to those questions and the potential policy solutions on the table. And this is where the private and public sector partnership is essential. And I'll take an example of cybersecurity so that, to be clear. So with respect to cybersecurity, the U.S. government is not on private sector networks. So they rely on the private sector to tell them what is going on, especially with respect to hacking for economic purposes. The U.S. government certainly has its own tools and insights in terms of general espionage practices, but they don't have the whole picture, and neither does the tech sector and the companies. So in order to understand the problem and ask ourselves the right questions, we really need that full picture. So it's essential that the private sector and the public sector collaborate, compare notes, and come up with the right solutions. And we can start by acknowledging that there are security concerns, there are risks, but we have to insist that any concern be dealt with in an evidence-based and rigorous process-oriented approach. So from my perspective, we look at what is the risk? Can the risk be mitigated? What are the current tools available? And how do we scope the tools or create new tools to avoid unintended or adverse consequences? And speaking for ITI, we have worked extensively with Congress and the U.S. government in terms of CFIUS reform as well as export controls reform, helping to shed some light on how to scope these important policies that are clearly geared towards a national security need appropriately in a way that we are not jeopardizing our own innovation and technological progress going forward. I will stop there.
Thank you, Naomi. Jimmy.
Sure, thanks. Naomi, I think, framed it really well in thinking about the broad picture between balancing security and economics. In my role at the Semiconductor Industry Association, I've been thinking about the U.S.-China technology competition from the dynamic of commercial competitiveness. And I want to talk a little bit about what exactly is 5G, what are the technologies of the future, what does it mean for the U.S., and what's China doing about them. So we have a factual sort of landscape of what's at stake, what's the economic cost and incentive forward, looking at these issues. And I think we're pretty well positioned to have a good outlook into this for the semiconductor industry. Roughly about a third of everything we sell goes into a communications device. So U.S. chip makers from Intel all the way down to companies in North Carolina, Boston are making all of the components that go into 5G and communication systems. So you literally can't pass a signal through any 5G or 4G device without a U.S. chip maker. And that's, I think, also a little understood fact that the U.S. still is competitive. We haven't lost the race in many areas, and there's reasons why. And there are areas, though, where China is making significant inroads. They are becoming successful, and there's for a mix of reasons, both state-led policy-wise or simple facts regarding the size of China's economy and the level of innovation that's happening there. And so it's really important to isolate exactly what we're talking about. What is the technology? Where is it being deployed? And specifically within that, because these are globalized ecosystems, where do the U.S. and China, it's not just a U.S.-China question either, where does Korea, Japan, Europe, Canada, where do they play in the global ecosystem? Because whether it's 5G, whether it's AI, whether it's semiconductors, there really is no single company or country that can dominate the full stack of the technology and the applications. And in order to make the pie big for everybody, it has to take the world working in concert to move forward and deploy these technologies together. Specifically thinking about 5G, which is really the hot topic that everyone's been hearing about. We just had the Mobile World Congress, this is the annual telecom gathering summit in Barcelona last week. All sorts of headlines about what the technology is going to bring, and also around concerns raised by the U.S. government and others regarding security. I think it's important to realize that whatever way you look at the security concerns, the economic potential on the commercial side of it is tremendous. And you're talking about the fifth generation of mobile networks that's going to bring upwards of 2,500 times X in terms of download speeds. You'll be able to download a movie roughly in 10 seconds compared to about 5-10 minutes of what you do today. So that's really the first evolution of 5G, and that's really about making the consumer experience faster, whether it's downloads or watching videos. But 5G is going to be transformational because it's going to bring huge technological benefits to industries that use 5G. And this is really a game changer because in previous iterations of 3 and 4G, it was really about making the handset or the phone experience faster, better. And in 5G, because you're bringing something called low latency, meaning that it's basic real time from the time the data is transmitted to the time you receive it, and also massive machine-to-machine communication. So you're getting all these IoT sensors hooked up to each other, and that's really what 5G is about. And so that's going to transform, if you think about it, agriculture. It's going to transform healthcare, businesses, industries. And so because of this transformational capability of 5G, I think that's really what's brought policymakers' attention to this iteration of the communication standard than previous standards. Because frankly, let's realize that telecommunications networks have never had this level of attention than they've had before, and that's because it's so transformational. And so, let alone for the U.S. chip industry, this is a huge opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for the United States as well. I think there's a study by IHS that says by 2035, roughly 1.3 trillion in value will be created by 5G just for the United States alone. And the 5G economy will be the size of the GDP of the state of Pennsylvania. So we're talking about huge implications for the United States economically as well. And those have to be weighed against all the different security considerations, political considerations that governments have worldwide. Because first and foremost, this is about delivering greater access, greater services to citizens worldwide so they can participate in the new economy. And China is, at the forefront and thinking about how this is a strategic technology for their country. And this is because the government has recognized for more than a decade that they need to have skin in the game when it comes to telecommunications networks. So looking back to the 90s and early 2000s, virtually everything that China run and operated in terms of their telecom network was imported. Now, today, Chinese vendors have about 80% of the domestic market share, and foreign vendors have 20%. About 10 years ago, it was the opposite. So a lot has happened in 10 years, and Chinese companies have closed the gap technologically and from a market share perspective. And today, in the worldwide telecom market, you really have only 5 or 6 big key vendors, of which 2 are Chinese. And I think
none of which are American.
In the radio network. So if you think about 5G is a big ecosystem, and you have the core networks that transmit the data and process it inside the telecommunications service provider's network. You have the wireless base stations that transmit the signals. Then you have the cell phones and your IoT devices that help you interact with it.
IoT is Internet of Things.
I lose points for an acronym. And then beyond that, you have all the components and chip vendors. And to say that China is dominating the 5G ecosystem is actually incorrect. Just for example, looking at chipsets for one pointed example, the U.S. has about half the entire worldwide market, and for 5G communications, it's more than that. And the other half, frankly, are mostly non-Chinese companies, South Korean, Taiwanese, and others. So there's many areas where China's been very good at innovating, and there's other areas where they're still very weak, even in the 5G ecosystem. And I think we cannot deny, for one logical reason, is that the size of China's economy has driven a lot of the scale that has made Chinese companies successful. And then the second factor, of course, is that the role of the government is far more outsized than it is here in the United States. And also, they're just keen on industrial planning. And that's something that's been historical about China. And moving forward, particularly under the current administration in China, it seems to be strengthening and accelerating. And that brings both benefits and drawbacks for China's technological ecosystem. Just thinking about the size and scale. For China, they have the world's largest fixed access network, broadband network, mobile network, internet users, number of internet transactions. Nearly all the world's cell phones, laptops, PCs, flat panel displays are all manufactured in China. And so China is central to this debate, whether it's deployment, development, or the security issues. And they have a lot at stake. But I think we also have to recognize that China's government has played a significant role. If you look back to 2G and 3G and 4G, and China lived in Beijing through the 3 and 4G deployment, working closely with companies now known as Nortel and Motorola and others. They faced a really tough challenge at the time because the government had very clear orders through their 3 state-owned carriers that they were going to buy domestic, and that's exactly what happened. Given the home court advantage that some of those large Chinese telecommunications companies had, that allowed them to build up scale, invest into R&D, and then also move into overseas markets in places like Southeast Asia, Philippines, Africa, and compete usually on an under pricing strategy against global telecommunications vendors. And that was about 10 years ago, and that's all history and all happened. And since then, though, I think you see, particularly in the telecommunications space, U.S. and global companies are competitive today. If you look at whether it's the patent or the IP landscape, but Chinese companies, particularly in this space, have significantly closed the gap and have made the question of with or without China almost impossible to answer because they're so central to both the deployment and the development of the technology. So thinking about this competition or the development of this technology in the future, it has to be how do the U.S. and China figure out to compartmentalize and manage their security concerns and risks, and then how do they also figure out how to unleash the technology? Because both the United States and China both stand to benefit from whether it's 5G, AI, or quantum computing being developed from a commercial perspective, and their industries stand to benefit. And the more the governments think about regulating for security purposes, the less we're going to see those benefits given, I think, to consumers in either country. So there's a lot at stake from a commercial and technological perspective. And again, going back to Naomi's point, it's really important to think about what exactly are we talking about? What is the technology? Where are the linkages between the U.S., China, and other countries? It's more than just the U.S., it's global. This is a global technology, global ecosystem. And so, no question on future technology development can be answered with just the U.S. and China alone. So I'll stop there. I want to save my remarks for the rest of the discussion, but just wanted to frame some of the baseline issues of what are we talking about from a technological perspective, what's the opportunity both from a commercial perspective, and then how do those influence governments' perspectives on security? And again, I think that's because these are truly transformational technologies, and more so than they were in the past, and so we just have to live with the fact that governments are going to be paying attention, and how do we direct that attention into a positive channel? Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. We focused so far on the technological and commercial sides, maybe turning a little bit more to the security end of the equation now with Dennis.
Great. First of all, let me commend Robert and the Wilson Center for putting this event together today. Given the turnout, it's obvious that it's an important issue that needs more discussion, although I would have liked to have seen how many of you showed up if we did have the snowstorm today, but you did get here. One of the wonderful things about my transition out of U.S. government to the academic world is I can now speak quite freely. So let me be very clear that I speak for myself today, not the U.S. government or Georgetown University. I'm giving you my personal views today, and some of them will be pretty candid. Let me start by reinforcing something that Jimmy and Naomi have said, and that is, why are we sitting here today? We're sitting here today because we're dealing with a cutting-edge technology in 5G. The CEO of Cisco was on television yesterday, and he said, in this particular case, the technology is living up to the hype. And I think from Jimmy's remarks about movie downloading and the rest of it, you can see that we are entering unknown territory. This is really a new, if you will, industrial revolution that we're on the verge of. And so with all this promise comes an unknown realm for national policy making. And national policy making, under the best of circumstances, is difficult and tends to be behind the times. I think we can all agree in Washington to that. But now we are in a phase where we're dealing with an unknown dimension, international actors, and an atmosphere of distrust. That makes national policy making incredibly complicated on this issue. Now, let me say that having served in government for over 3 decades, I think we've so far understated the sea change in American policy today. And I want to really hit it harder. For the past 5 decades since Kissinger went to China, the premise of American policy was that we could work with China. that we would be finding common ground. But I'm afraid I have to say that Americans in this town, maybe not all over the United States, are now seeing President Xi as more like Mao than like Deng Xiaoping. We were more comfortable with Deng Xiaoping than Mao, let's face it. And we thought that Deng was bringing China closer to being more like us than less like us. Whereas we now see President Xi taking steps that seem to be accentuating the differences between our two cultures and societies. This reassessment has been building for some time. This is not the Trump administration. This is across the political spectrum of the United States. And one of the things that we saw, and Naomi referred to it, but I want to hit it a little harder again, is that China is not playing as much by the international liberal order rules as we expected. So in the cyber realm, we saw the PLA and the Ministry of State Security becoming much bolder in their commercial cyber espionage. PLA Unit 61398 in Shanghai has been labeled the APT-1. It's notorious. Dozens, if not hundreds, of human actors involved in that PLA organization who have attacked 141 different organizations around the world. Hackers associated with the Tianjin Bureau of the Ministry of State Security, labeled APT-10, similarly indicted by the Trump administration in December of 2018 for hacking managed service providers by uploading malicious software to gain access in the economic intelligence from at least 12 countries and the personnel data of 100,000 U.S. naval personnel. This is not a secret. This is in the indictment, okay? These are not rogue actors. These are professionals. How do we know they're professionals? Because they do their work during office hours in China. That's how you know they're professionals. It's not that hard to figure out, okay? Now, why does the Chinese government allow such activity? Well, simply put, there are a different set of standards. In all my years in U.S. intelligence, and I am being absolutely truthful here, I never once handed information to an American company or considered handing information to an American firm for economic competitive reasons. Why? There is no U.S. law that allows me to do that. Robert Gates, who was the Director of Central Intelligence and Secretary of Defense, said in an interview 2 years ago that he actually contemplated this, that he went to officials in the administration while he was Director of Central Intelligence and asked if he could start helping American companies, and the answer was not only no, but hell no. We're not doing this. And we don't do this. James Clapper, a couple years ago, said, "It is not a secret that the intelligence community collects information about economic and financial matters. What we do not, as we have said many times, do is use our foreign intelligence capability to steal the trade secrets of foreign companies on behalf of U.S. companies to enhance their international competitiveness or increase their bottom line." Frankly, one of the problems is, who would you hand it to? Do you hand it to Google? Do you hand it to Intel? Do you hand it to Apple? How do you decide who you give this competitive edge to? And believe me, the moment you handed it to one of them, you're going to get a lawsuit in an American court as fast as possible by the others. So it's not feasible, and we don't do it. That's not to say that some of our allies, by the way, don't do it. Robert Gates said that about 12 to 20 countries around the world do economic espionage for the benefit of their corporations. So I think that we have to understand that there is reason for the American government concern because of these aggressive behavior in the cyber espionage area. It's not a figment of our imagination. However, the question that Robert has posed today is a different one, and that is the U.S. claims of China's ability to install equipment to spy or attack digital infrastructure. Now, personally, I've seen no credible reporting to date that any cyber attacks against the United States were conducted by embedded code in Chinese-supplied hardware. If we look back, for example, at the largest data breach ever involving the United States, where 21.5 million Americans' personal records were lost by OPM, I think the conclusion on that is there were contractors with Chinese passports involved in that project. It had nothing to do with the equipment itself. It had everything to do with insider threat. And the US government has come forward with no evidence on Huawei or any other firm cooperating with the Chinese government for intelligence purposes. When the Australian government decided to ban Huawei, they said publicly, quote, "The government considers that the involvement of vendors who are likely to be subject to extrajudicial directions from a foreign government that conflict with Australian law may risk failure by the carrier to adequately protect a 5G network." They did not say that they had evidence. We've seen some uncorroborated reports in the French press and the Australian press. And we had this case of a Bloomberg article in October of 2018 that suggested there was actually a microchip. That has been totally and completely discounted as fabrication. The company did an audit. The head of Apple has said this did not occur. So that is not factual. Somebody made up a story and gave it to Bloomberg. And unless somebody in this room has some evidence to the contrary, that story should go away and never be talked about again because it's just not true. It's a hoax. So if we have no clear evidence of Huawei's involvement in malicious Chinese government cyber attacks, why call for the bans? Simply put, it's because it's not difficult to see how Beijing could use Huawei. You've already heard about the various Chinese laws that require Chinese firms to cooperate with the Chinese government. And I find the claims by Huawei's lawyers that these laws don't apply to them to be dubious at best. Malicious codes and backdoors into computer hardware is a real risk. Kill switches are technically a reality and would be a disaster if used suddenly, for example, to take down the entire traffic control system of a city like London. But the real question here comes down to the question of acceptable risk and mitigation. I've had the chance, and I'm sure Jimmy and Naomi have too, to meet with officials of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre. They make a rather persuasive argument that it's not about banning Huawei or ZTE, but rather hiving off those areas of the networks of greatest concern to national security and simply not using those products from China in those systems. They left me with the impression that diversification of suppliers and due diligence in testing and monitoring of installed equipment are the keys to making it more difficult for any supplier to act maliciously. I would have to say at this moment, without further evidence, I come down on the side of not banning China companies, except in those areas of highest national security concern. China would not rely on U.S. suppliers in its national security telecommunications network, and we shouldn't do the same. But banning Chinese companies entirely does not puts us on the road, to a digital Cold War that I think would have enormous detrimental effects on both sides. That said, let me make a few recommendations for the Chinese government and the U.S. government, very briefly. First, China needs to drop this case against the two Canadians unless it offers explicit evidence of espionage. The fact that so many Chinese officials have said these arrests are linked to the Canadian detention of Ms. Meng is outrageous and counterproductive to Beijing's long-term goals. It merely reinforces the notion that the Chinese legal system is highly politicized. The U.S. has put credible evidence of Ms. Meng's crimes before the Canadian courts. These two situations are not equivalent. Second, China needs to consider revising its cyber and intelligence laws to make clearer that there is a bright line between private firms and the Chinese government. There must be explicit legal procedures in place on how and when the Chinese government gains access to data and capabilities of these companies. Third, Huawei itself and ZTE need to be much more transparent about their relationships to the Chinese government. It's simply not credible to those of us in the West when Huawei's chairman claims that he would deny any Chinese government request to use his company for espionage. What legal grounds does he have for such a denial? Has he ever done that? How could this firm refuse given the nature of monopolistic and unrestrained power of the Communist Party? Fourth, the Chinese government needs to clarify the role of the Communist Party in relation to private companies. We have all read the party has insisted on a greater role recently in the management of private Chinese firms. But what does that mean? What authorities does the party representative have within a firm like Huawei? And what is the real management structure? On the US side, let me give one big suggestion, and that is we need to end our aversion to national industrial policies. There is a great irony in our concern over foreign involvement in 5G development while being heavily dependent on foreign suppliers for parts of the 5G network. As with so many areas of US infrastructure, US presidents and the US Congress have been woefully negligent in not coming up with ways to address our infrastructure needs. I am a firm believer that the best way to compete with China is to get our own economic house in order. In summary, policymakers in the US and other countries have legitimate concerns over China's involvement in the evolving world of 5G. I do not believe this is a case primarily of the United States seeking commercial advantage, but I'm not naive on that point either, and I think some would like to see the disengagement of the United States and China in the telecommunications area. But I think that President Trump has made the right choice to date not to move precipitously to ban Huawei and ZTE from the US marketplace. Such a decision, if ultimately made, needs to be based on sound evidence that the risk of Chinese involvement is too great and cannot be mitigated. Such a judgment needs to be made in consultation not only with our companies, as Naomi suggested, but with our allies. And I suspect that many of these people in the private sector understand this issue better than many of those in the US government. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all three of you. That's, I think, a comprehensive look at the major issues. I wonder if I could start by asking each of you one quick question, and then we'll open it up. First, Naomi, and this sort of picks up on something that Dennis mentioned, ending the U.S. aversion to national industrial policy. When you think about public-private cooperation, what forms might that take? There's still a strong impulse to leave it to the market in the United States. Whereas in the rest of the world, I quoted this German writer at the beginning, these are macroeconomic issues that need to be dealt with across government, across industry. The financial, commercial, security sectors probably need to be coordinated, it would seem. It's something that looks like an industrial policy. What do you see as prospects for that? And what do you see as the major obstacles? Then Jimmy, we'll just do these sort of 1, 2, 3. We'll go for sort of quick answers. You said that this 80-20 shift has happened over about 10 years, from America supplying 80% of the components within the Chinese domestic IT system to 20%.
In telecommunications.
In telecommunications. So if that continues, I mean, having watched China for a while, we tend to get it wrong. They tend to develop more quickly than we think. What if they get semiconductors? Is that game over? Because that seems to be a lot at the center of some of the policies that you haven't been advocating policies, but the description you've given depends on American leadership in semiconductors. What are the prospects for that going away? China, with its huge market, extensive investment in R&D, its ability to scale up very rapidly, as well as perhaps to beg, borrow, or steal other technologies. Would your basic assessment change if they get semiconductors, and what are the prospects for that? And last, Dennis, you did speak to this, but I'd like to come back to it because you know what a lot of the attitudes are now on the Hill and in Washington more broadly. It's understood that China is seeking what it calls comprehensive national power, which is their way of talking about sort of the prestige that we enjoy, commercial, security, soft power. And because of our concern about China's quest for comprehensive national power, there's a growing sense that any developments that are to China's benefit are to our detriment. We've even seen reports of Americans overseas trying to convince allies not to install Huawei equipment, making the argument that we don't need evidence, that we know what we know about China's intentions, the nature of the regime, and its desire to spread illiberalism and generally to develop its own prerogatives worldwide, and therefore it doesn't have to be evidence-based. It can be a political decision. And what do you think is the best answer? You've hinted at it, but to that approach. So maybe if we could just go for those, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Thank you.
Sure. So on public-private sector cooperation and the issue of industrial policy, I will be clear that that is not what I meant by private sector, public sector cooperation. ITI is very much in favor of market-driven economics. And I would even say that China has demonstrated that industrial policy can go wrong in terms of overwhelming a certain sector with subsidies and that causing overcapacity. We've seen that in steel and aluminum probably most prominently. So what do I mean by public-private sector cooperation? In the security context, it has to do with risk and risk mitigation. And the public sector needs to be telling companies what they see as the risks, as the threats, and what they are using as evidence to draw those conclusions. And the private sector also needs to demonstrate and show what the risks are. There also needs to be a significant amount of work done in the private sector to demonstrate to the public sector how risks are mitigated. I think that is a big open space right now, because it's one thing for companies to say, we mitigate risk in our supply chain and on our networks, and it's another thing for them to tell U.S. policymakers in concrete and understandable terms, this is how we mitigate risk. This is how we make a determination as to whether there is an overwhelming risk that merits cutting something out in its entirety, or if there's a way to approach this in a risk-based manner. And finally, this all leads into how to develop the appropriate response and policy. And that policy needs to address any risk that cannot be mitigated or develop ways to mitigate it. But it also needs to ensure that it's not hamstringing technological development. Our companies are developing next generation technologies. And these are the technologies that the US government touts and says they want us to have a competitive advantage in. Technologies related to 5G and artificial intelligence. So if they want US companies and multinational companies to be as competitive as possible, they have to understand that there is a need to let the market make some of these determinations and to not put companies on too short of a leash.
Thank you.
So I think just picking up on that and then going into the China semiconductor question, which is a great question. Happy to answer that one. I think it's important to remember, the United States and China were two very different stages of development and were two different economic models. For China, they are a country trying to close the gap, trying to study from others. And there's cases where industrial policy, where it's been very, very inefficient, has still ultimately been successful from the perspective of the Chinese leadership, who look at the means, look at the end, not the means. And so, sure, China wasted a whole lot of money on 3G. They did a proprietary TD-SCDMA standard, which was their version of 3G, and it was incompatible with many parts of the worldwide network. But arguably now, China has learned a lot from that. That 10 billion plus investment they made allowed them to train up a workforce, build up an ecosystem, establish companies, and put them in a position to be able to compete for 5G leadership now that they've closed the gap technologically. So yes, industrial policy can be hugely wasteful and inefficient. Looking at Japan, for example, they also built their own proprietary telecommunications network, and that led them down a dead-end road, really. But China is actually, in some ways, learning more than Japan and others did from their mistakes, and has been willing to be more inclusive of global standards in that space. So I think there's that industrial policy question. For China, has its own factors, its own reasons why it is or isn't successful. For the United States, we don't necessarily need industrial policy like China has, because we're not trying to catch up with anyone. We're trying to extend the lead or innovate entirely new technologies that China isn't even thinking about. And one of those areas, for example, is in semiconductors, where, as I mentioned, the United States today has the benefit of being the worldwide leader in the technology, whether it's market share, technology segments, or chip feature size. Even in the 5G space, your radio chip, your fingerprint sensor, your memory chip, most of it is American in terms of the components. You look in a European telecom box or a Korean telecom box, it's all going to be the same in terms of chip vendor dominance. And that is exactly why the Chinese government is focused on it. This is something they don't make. They see that vulnerability, and they equate it to the vulnerability that China has in jet engines and a couple of other high value add manufacturing goods that they just haven't been able to make on their own. They've been trying for about 30 years to do so, and they've been wildly unsuccessful. And I think that's because this is an industry where you can have a lot of capital, but you also need knowledge of the market, and you need to have smart people. And China, yes, they have the world's largest higher education system, but in terms of quality, they actually have a shortage of probably 100 to 200,000 engineers who actually know something about semiconductor technology to be able to apply it and be successful. So, yes, China has a lot of advantages when it comes to specific industries and technologies. Some of them are just really hard to do. Now, that being said, looking at what happened in telecoms or in high-speed rail or in solar, wind, steel, LED, shipbuilding, there's a track record of success on behalf of China. But again, that success is sort of half success in that they get an industry, but at what cost, and what does it do to the global innovation ecosystem? And how much money do they have to spend annually just to keep parts of it alive? Because much of it's not very profitable. I think in the semiconductor space, it's going to be a lot harder for China. The technology involved is simply at a much greater magnitude and complexity when you compare it to steel and aluminum or even shipbuilding or high-speed rail. You're talking about technology that's developed over decades and $10 billion plus advanced factories with cutting-edge tools, really blending physics, science, math all together. And that's something that we have not seen China do very well to date. But we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that it will happen. And China has a lot of smart people, a big country, and so I think we should operate on the assumption here in the United States that they will be successful, and it's just a matter of when. And going back to Dennis's point, that really means that we need to get our own house in order. We need to invest in the areas where we have current strengths and decide what are the industries of the future, where do we currently have advantages, and we should double down and invest in those. And in terms of industrial policy here in the U.S., what does that look like? I think it doesn't mean the government picking winners. It doesn't mean creating standard enterprises, but it does mean boosting investment into education to have the workforce. It does mean increasing government investment to basic research. If you look back to, say, 1980, the U.S. Percentage of GDP invested into basic research is half as it was today. And now we're facing a far more competitive global environment. We don't necessarily have guaranteed success in these industries. And so, Congress in particular needs to work with the administration to double funding to basic science, to even applied science at places like DARPA, Department of Energy. There's some positive signals, but nearly not enough in that space.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, on the question of, the United States going out to countries and saying, we don't need to have the evidence, it's pretty obvious what the problem is here. I think you've seen different reactions from different nations. The Australians and the New Zealanders seem to have accepted that argument.
Right.
and they have gone to a ban. The UK, Germany, and others are looking at the economics of it and saying, if we do this, we will set ourselves back, and we will not be economically competitive if we simply ban Chinese corporations from involvement. So their assessment of risk versus benefit is very different from that of some other countries. And it's going to be interesting. The British are right now, as you've seen in the Financial Times and other newspapers, trying to decide how they're going to come out on this. There is a report that's due sometime this spring, I'm not sure exactly when, from the British government that will try and make a choice. They're being leaned heavily upon by the United States, but they've had a lot of experience with Huawei equipment, and they are really thinking this through. So it's going to be interesting to see whether everybody buys this argument that, you know, there's obvious reason to keep Huawei out. On national industrial policy, I'm really glad Jimmy said what he said, because I'm not talking about a Chinese-style national industrial policy, but I am talking about incentives, money to basic research, these kinds of things. And when we say, well, the private sector can do it, my second home, my vacation home, is in Chautauqua County, New York, the poorest county in the state. You want to talk about rural cyber? Come to my county. Half the county doesn't have anything but dial-up service still. So the private sector is not doing a fantastic job in many rural areas of the United States on this. So I'm not so sure that leaving this all to the private sector is necessarily the answer to these questions. We created the interstate highway system for a reason, and it was highly successful, and General President Eisenhower did it because as a young soldier, he took a road trip across the United States and realized that there were no good roads in the United States. I wonder in the cyber realm whether we need to rethink, again, this aversion to industrial policies. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and do wait for a microphone. Yes, right back here.
John Holden with McClarty Associates. During the Cold War, although it was cold comfort, we had something called mutual assured destruction, MAD. Is there anything analogous in the cyber sphere? Is there at some point at which an action on one side will trigger something that would ultimately be a disincentive for that actor?
So this is about threats to infrastructure, really cyber warfare. Dennis, do you want to take any?
Sure.
First?
I actually was listening to former Director Woolsey talk about this the other day, and I'll give you his point of view, and that is that the United States needs to demonstrate more fully our offensive cyber capabilities to the Chinese. That we need to be more upfront that if we wanted to, we could do a lot to them. That, I guess, would be in your category of a declarative, mutual assured destruction strategy. John, to be honest with you, I haven't thought this question through enough. Mutually assured destruction strategies are pretty extreme. But certainly, I think, I guess what I'd say is the Chinese need to think about this. We are capable of a lot without going into detail. There are several books you can read on what we've done in a certain foreign country. That was quite dramatic in this regard. You know, we have Cyber Command. We are developing offensive capabilities for use in wartime. So I think if the Chinese push us to this point, there may well be at some point a decision to go in that direction, but I haven't seen it yet.
You're talking about Stuxnet?
I didn't say that word.
Okay. No.
I mean, just to add to that, I think there's also the economic realm. If you think about the mutual interdependence itself should be deterrent towards greater bifurcation of the systems. And I think as you see if you see an inability to contain the security concerns, you're going to see greater bifurcation or splintering, as some say, of the global ICT infrastructure, and that would be devastating for both countries. given that, if you look at the revenue model of any global tech company, China is critical for them. And China today, and they have a very long road to go before they're completely independent, and they may never will be. So they need access to all these systems and components, just like anyone else does. So the more they push on this front, the more that we push, the greater economic cost it's going to inflict on both countries. And that in the past has also been another form of deterrence towards some of the most unfavorable outcomes.
Okay, over here.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this goes to Dennis, your statement about many of these rural areas. There's about 48 million Americans that don't have access really to the internet.
Right.
48 million, and actually in some ways it's growing. But also if you look at the inner city, you go to Ward 8 or Ward 7 here in Washington, D.C., you have some of the same things. So you have many of your inner city, these legacy cities do not have the high-speed internet. How do we bring this about? And going to, Jimmy's earlier comments on, access and technologies and all that, how do we bring this to the people? And then are we avoiding using what's called TV white space? That may be a way to easily and inexpensively bring this type of connectivity. But as we expand the technologies in this competitive world, we have to have all these people. These 48 million people are important to the economy, and they're locked out.
Thank you. Maybe after Dennis's comments, also Naomi, is there anything that you see that the public sector can do to incentivize the private sector to go into these areas that haven't been deemed profitable?
Well, I hate to sound like some of the Democratic presidential candidates here, but I think there is a socioeconomic divide in this country in terms of cyber that is a real inequality that we don't look at. I think many of us in the higher socioeconomic classes in this country simply assume that everybody has what we have, and they don't. And there are barriers based on price, and there are barriers that we've talked about based on infrastructure. This is why I really reject the notion that government doesn't have a role to play here. I think government has a big role to play, and we just need to find what that role is, because I agree, it is outrageous that many Americans are not being brought into the 21st century right now.
So in terms of incentives, I agree with what has been said thus far, that government does have a role in terms of incentivizing technological development and incentivizing students to be able to and to choose the path of learning of higher technology and engineering. I will say, I do think that the burden is on tech companies with respect to this specific problem set. And I say that because tech does not have the best reputation right now. And to the extent that tech can demonstrate that there is societal benefit, that they care about the rural communities and those that are not as well served as the upper middle class communities, I think that is to the tech sector's advantage. So I don't know if there's an incentive that the government can or should create in that area, but I absolutely see it as a worthwhile endeavor for the tech sector writ large. They have the capability, and we need to start demonstrating more publicly that there is real societal benefit to these new technologies.
I'll just add one point there. I think, there are ways that we can, and we have actually been successful in order to spur demand. I think government policy is good when we can think about how do we get more people using the devices, the technology across a greater swath of the economic spectrum, and in a way that's technology neutral, so that whichever way the government stimulates that demand, it allows the private sector to fill the void. One good example we have right now, obviously we could do better, hence your example in New York, is the Universal Service Fund, where everyone pays literally in your cell phone tax, your phone bill, goes back to a fund that the FCC manages to help subsidize rural broadband development in communities. We also had an increase in that in the stimulus package in 2008 as well, and that was during 4G and 3G deployment. So, obviously the scale isn't big enough if we still have a gap there. But that's one way government can actually help bring technology to impoverished communities, and that's in a way that's technology neutral, and we're not picking winners. It's simply stimulating the demand side and incentivizing these carriers to give the technology to areas where there may not be that financial incentive to date. One other thing is on a technology perspective, actually 5G in some ways will help alleviate part of the problem in that it really gets the user off the fixed network because the signal goes a lot further. It can go through a lot more buildings, get through a lot more roadblocks like mountains and other things. So the technology also will bring improvements on that front.
And is it not also true that Huawei and other Chinese companies are offering to help bridge this gap because they bring in lower cost components for everything from the handsets to the routers and servers? This has been part of their pitch in Africa and South America and around the world, that they can actually do this at cost and fill the gap if they're permitted to.
Yeah, many small providers in the United States use Huawei equipment
Right.
because of the cost factor.
Okay, why don't we come right down front, sir?
Yes, Chris McRae. So I wanted to build a bit on that a bit further in that, Americans are presumably 7 or 8% of the world's population. If we think about sort of 5G for human development, and if we go back to what Kissinger himself was saying in November 2016, what do countries like India as well as China as well as Africa actually want from 5G? In some ways, Huawei is actually nearer the on-the-ground things like education and health and agriculture. Maybe the problem is different sectors, and I understand why some sectors are really confidential for Americans, but it'd be a terrible shame for the whole of the world, I think, if we get all of these things muddled up and don't realize that in some ways the distributed technology, as far as I understand it, of 5G, which Huawei and China's, more massively done across huge continents, also is incredibly valuable for the future. So I'd just like to know how you see that side of things.
Well, I think the panel so far has been really careful to acknowledge this and really not to vilify Huawei's action globally. Does anyone have anything to add? It was well said. Anything to add on that?
I think that in the third world, Huawei products and ZTE products are incredibly important at this point. We don't make handsets that are as cheap as what a Huawei or ZTE does. We don't make these things. So again, I think we get back to this question of risk-benefit. And from the point of view of many third world countries, the risk of having Huawei potentially cooperating with their government is less of a concern than getting these kinds of goods and services to their people. And so different countries are going to make different calculations on the risk-benefit scale.
But just a little pressure on that. When they begin, some countries in considering making different calculations have heard threats from us that if you cooperate, if you have Chinese systems, that may limit cooperations of certain kinds with the United States. Does anybody want to comment on that as sort of a policy or a pitch?
Well, I think that's most important in NATO and with our allies, because the question at that point becomes, how do you share sensitive information over telecommunication systems if you can't do that? Now, I will say there is another factor that somebody brought up to me the other day that I'm still working through in my own head, and that is allowing China influence over you. In other words, if you go Huawei and then you do something with Taiwan that Beijing may not approve of, are you going to find that your supplies from Huawei are mysteriously delayed? There is the question of, once you make this choice, have you put yourself in a position where you might be the subject of undue influence? Again, that's a hypothetical, but we certainly have seen Chinese economic sanctions against people who did things, particularly in relation to Taiwan, that they didn't like.
Thank you. Naomi?
I'll just add on the intent versus capability side. So from my perspective, this is another area where we have to be careful about making assumptions and what that leads us to conclude. So even if we accept the fact that a Chinese company may be directed by the Chinese government to do something, that does not mean in of itself that they have the capability to do that, and or that it poses a threat and cannot be mitigated. So those are all subsequent questions that we have to ask. To me, can a company be influenced by a government is a very political question. And there's nothing to stop any company, really, apart from standing on its principles and its economic life, to stop a company from being influenced by any number of parties. Any company of any origin could be influenced by an entity that seeks to buy it off. So just to say that because a company could possibly be directed by a government, I think is not sufficient in terms of what do we do about that from a policy perspective.
Okay. Jorge. Microphone. Sorry.
One argument I have heard is that Huawei has a big advantage over most other competitors in 5G. A year or two, in fact, I've heard. Is that correct or not? Just a factual question. Thank you.
I think there's no doubt that Huawei is extremely competitive in telecommunications technology. It's the largest in terms of revenue, and they also now have the largest spend into research development, surpassing their peers, particularly from their European competitors. So, and in many aspects, Huawei is looking to vertically integrate their technology ecosystem to be able to produce even some of their own chips. Now, they're not able to do everything they need, but some of those they're very competitive or even more competitive than some of their competitors. So, I mean, Huawei is absolutely a global giant, and that's not something that's going to change. In terms of, are they ahead or not, I think one interesting benchmark to look at again is R&D. And if you're not able to reinvest your profits back into research development, if you have to pay off debt, loans, restructure your workforce in other countries. Those are things that Huawei right now is not under pressure to do, unlike their other competitors. And so they've just have a lot more capital to spend, whether it's into their people or technology. And unless that changes, it's going to be very difficult for their competitors to maintain their competitiveness with them. That being said, it's not a one single winner takes all across the entire technology spectrum. As I mentioned before, 5G is really an ecosystem of technology, and there are areas in which each telecommunications hardware vendor does things that others don't in terms of comparative advantage. And so some of the European vendors are very strong and excel at the core network, these big back-end data centers that process all the data from all the phones and the data. And that's something really traditionally the European vendors have had a lot of strength in, whereas a lot of the Chinese telecommunication vendor experience comes from the radio network, which are the base stations that send the signals out to the phones and other devices. And so I think there's complementary advantages that each has, but Huawei still, from a scale perspective, is surely ahead.
Okay. Yes, sir. Here in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Jose Saenz I'm a graduate student at American University. And my question has to do with, regarding the conference in Barcelona that happened a week ago, some press had characterized as Huawei as the architect of the 5G infrastructure. So given that fact, and as Dennis mentioned, the different standards that Chinese companies have and the Chinese government also has, and all the different times that policy has regarding these technologies like 5G, IoT, or AI, are democracies and market economies ready to deal with this competition, with having a competitor like China? And are our systems, our democratic institutions ready to deal with these kind of technologies?
Who wants to go first?
Do you want to go in?
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
I think you ask a really excellent question that we're struggling with. As Jimmy was talking about, and I think it's an important point, one of the things that Huawei has is very deep pockets. They are able to access capital, and they are able to go into markets and bid very low because they have essentially the backing of the Chinese government. Our companies in democracies don't get that particular advantage, right? Our companies have to figure out how to do this on a economically efficient level. And when I was at the White House, and I would have American companies come to me and say, we can't compete in Africa. We come in with a bid, and Huawei always underbids us. And they can do that because they can take a loss that our stockholders aren't going to let us take, right? If an American company were to go out and do a bunch of loss leaders in Africa, think what happens to it. So there is this problem. There's no question that there is a real difference between our economic systems and our political systems that makes it hard in various markets to compete. And we haven't figured out that problem. And so I do think that this is an enormous advantage for the Chinese companies. That said, I also think we still have enormous advantages in innovation, creativity that they don't have, because one of the things that happens when you have such deep pockets is your incentive to be efficient and creative and innovate is decreased. But I'll let Jimmy speak to that.
Yeah, I think that, brings us to the broader question of, in terms of competitiveness, having a fair marketplace is really critical for the success of U.S. companies. That's where we've thrived. And, it's a well-known fact that the Chinese government certainly provides a whole lot of capital that's non-market based to their companies. And we need to do something to figure out what are the new rules going to be, because clearly the World Trade Organization, the organization that governs a lot of these rules, particularly around subsidies, hasn't done its work that it should have, because we're here today and none of that was ever really challenged or disputed in the WTO. And that's because the current rules where they sit are really prospective, in that a country can actually challenge subsidies that were given, say, to China's domestic telecom vendors, but you have to wait until you're harmed. Mm-hmm. And so if you're already harmed, it's basically a coroner's inquest. You're trying to get reparations for the damage that was done to you. And so right now, actually, the United States is working with its allies. Right now, it's just the European Union and Japan to try and rewrite those rules, because they don't want that to happen again. And we all share that common goal of trying to ensure that China, they want these industries, but they have to ensure that they don't destroy them in the process of creating them. And that's really, I think, ultimately bad for innovation, too. If you look at whether it's electric vehicles or solar or some of the lithium batteries, China is making huge government investments into these sectors. They might drive the cost down in terms of a commodity, but they also cut off the innovation because they lead to a lowest common denominator of your product in terms of pricing. And so that really squeezes out an ability to invest into future technologies, diverse technologies for different applications. So we've heard from, I was talking to a panel of experts on solar technology and saying actually there's much better, more efficient, higher powered solar panels out there, but because the market's been crowded out by cheap imports from China, they can't compete against them. So I think ultimately
how do we change the rules so this doesn't happen again? And thankfully, we're thinking about it, but still a long way to go.
Naomi, any final thoughts?
I see right now different dynamics in the international system, and I think Jimmy is absolutely right that there are certain rules within the WTO that are no longer functioning as they should, no longer necessarily applicable. And to your point about democracies and market-oriented economies versus those that are more top-down, I do think we're at a point in time where the world economy is trying to reconcile those different systems. And we still do very much need agreed upon norms and rules of the road, but it's fairly obvious that the ones we're currently working off of are outdated.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Please do stay tuned. The Kissinger Institute and the Wilson Center as a whole will be paying increasing attention to this question of security, espionage, commerce, tech, with relation to U.S.-China relations broadly, and we hope you will join us again soon. Thank you to Dennis Wilder, Naomi Wilson, and Jimmy Goodrich for your time today. Thanks.
Thank you.